I found out about my brother's wedding 3 weeks after it happened, and I found out from Instagram. Not from a call. Not from a text. From a carousel of professionally edited photos showing Marcus in a tailored navy suit, his arm around a woman in an elaborate white gown, both of them beaming under an arch of pale roses while 200 guests I would never meet applauded in the background. The caption read, "Best day of our lives. Surrounded by everyone who matters." I sat in my car outside the grocery store, groceries melting in the trunk, staring at that phrase. Everyone who matters. The implication was not subtle. I had not mattered enough to receive an invitation. I had not mattered enough to receive a warning. I had not even mattered enough to be told after the fact, to get a courtesy call explaining why my own brother had celebrated the most significant milestone of his adult life without bothering to let me know it was happening at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I scrolled through 47 photos. Marcus laughing with groomsmen I vaguely recognized from his college years. His new wife, Vanessa, posing with bridesmaids in dusty rose dresses. The first dance. The cake cutting. The speeches. An entire day meticulously documented and shared with thousands of strangers online. While his own sister learned about it, the way you learn about a celebrity wedding, through curated images designed to project flawless happiness to an audience that did not include me. My hands shook as I enlarged one particular photo. In the background, partially obscured by a centerpiece, I could see my parents. My mother wore a dress I had never seen before. Something elegant and expensive looking. The kind of outfit she would have spent weeks selecting. My father stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, the formal posture he adopted for important photographs. They looked proud. They looked happy. They looked like people who had just watched their son get married, which of course they had because unlike me they had been invited. They had known. They had participated. They had chosen not to tell me. I called my mother immediately, not because I expected honesty but because I needed to hear what explanation she would attempt to construct. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice carrying that careful brightness she used when she knew a conversation might become difficult. "Maya, hello, I was just thinking about you." The lie was so immediate and so reflexive that I almost laughed. If she had been thinking about me, she might have thought to mention that my only sibling had gotten married. I did not ease into the topic. I did not soften my approach with pleasantries or preamble. I simply said, "I just saw Marcus's wedding photos on Instagram. When exactly were you planning to tell me he got married?" The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of someone rapidly calculating which version of events would cause the least amount of trouble, which narrative would allow her to maintain the position she had carefully constructed where she was not complicit in my exclusion but merely an innocent bystander caught between competing loyalties. "Oh, Maya," she finally said, and the tone was all wrong, too sympathetic, too understanding, as if I were the one creating unnecessary drama rather than the person who had been deliberately erased from a family event. "I wanted to talk to you about that, but things happened so quickly," and Marcus said Vanessa was handling the guest list. And you know how stressful wedding planning can be. I let her words hang in the air between us, this explanation that explained nothing, this attempt to diffuse responsibility across so many people and circumstances that no single person could be held accountable for the choice to exclude me. She wanted me to accept that my exclusion was somehow an accident of logistics, rather than a deliberate decision made by people who decided I did not deserve to be present for one of the most important days in my brother's life. "Mom," I said slowly, giving her one opportunity to stop performing and start being honest. "Marcus got married 3 weeks ago. You were there. Dad was there. I can see you in the background of the photos. You are telling me that in 3 weeks, nobody in this family thought to pick up a phone and tell me that my brother had a wedding?" She made a small sound, something between a sigh and a protest. "It was complicated, sweetheart. Vanessa had very specific ideas about the wedding, and she and Marcus decided together who would be invited, and I did not think it was my place to interfere with their decisions. They are adults. It was their day. I had to respect their wishes." There it was. The confirmation. This had not been an oversight. This had not been a miscommunication or a lost invitation or a problem with the mail. This had been a choice. Marcus and Vanessa had actively decided that I would not be invited to the wedding, And my parents had accepted this decision without question, without protest, without even the basic courtesy of informing me that the exclusion was happening. What wishes? I asked, my voice steady despite the pressure building in my chest. What possible reason could Marcus have for not inviting his own sister to his wedding? My mother's hesitation told me she knew the answer but did not want to say it aloud. Did not want to be the one to deliver the message that would make the rejection explicit and undeniable. You would need to talk to Marcus about that, she finally said. It was not my decision. I cannot speak for what he and Vanessa were thinking. The deflection was masterful in its cowardice. She would not defend the decision, but she would not challenge it either. She would not explain it, but she would not apologize for it. She would simply position herself as a neutral party, who bore no responsibility for my exclusion and no obligation to address the harm it caused. I ended the call without saying goodbye, not out of anger but out of clarity. There was nothing more to be gained from that conversation. My mother had already told me everything I needed to know. She had chosen comfort over courage, had chosen to preserve her relationship with Marcus and his new wife rather than advocate for basic fairness toward her daughter. She had attended a wedding that I was excluded from, and then had chosen to keep that exclusion secret for weeks, allowing me to exist in ignorance while the rest of my family participated in a milestone I would never be able to experience or recover. I sat in the parking lot as the afternoon light shifted and my ice cream continued melting in bags I no longer cared about. I thought about calling Marcus directly, but I already knew what that conversation would sound like. He would be defensive. He would justify the decision. He would tell me that Vanessa had concerns, that the guest list was limited, that it was nothing personal, just a matter of space and budget and priorities. He would make it sound reasonable, even as he described excluding his only sister from the most important day of his life. The more I thought about it, the more clearly I could see the architecture of what had happened. This was not sudden. This was not impulsive. Someone had made a calculated decision that my presence at the wedding would be unwelcome, and that someone was almost certainly Vanessa, the woman I had met exactly twice, the woman who was now legally my sister-in-law, the woman who apparently had enough influence over my brother to convince him that family loyalty was less important than whatever objection she had constructed about me. I opened Instagram again and looked at Vanessa's profile, scrolling back through months of carefully curated content. She posted frequently, documenting every aspect of her life with the kind of attention to aesthetic detail that suggested she viewed her existence as a brand to be managed rather than a life to be lived. There were photos of elaborate brunches, vacation destinations, outfit combinations, and motivational quotes in elegant fonts superimposed over sunset backgrounds. Her engagement announcement had received thousands of likes. Her wedding countdown had been chronicled weekly with photos of dress fittings, venue tours, cake tastings, and flower arrangements. She had documented every microscopic detail of wedding planning, except for one conspicuous absence. There were no photos that included me, no mention of Marcus having a sister, no acknowledgement that he had family beyond our parents, who appeared occasionally in carefully posed shots that emphasized Vanessa's ability to charm future in-laws. It was as if I had been edited out of Marcus's life story before Vanessa even entered it, as if she had done research and determined that I was a narrative complication best left unacknowledged. I wondered what story she had told herself about me to justify the exclusion. Perhaps she had decided I was difficult or judgmental. Perhaps she had interpreted some past interaction as evidence that I would not be sufficiently enthusiastic about her wedding. Perhaps she simply preferred a guest list composed entirely of people who would admire her without reservation, and she suspected I might not perform that role convincingly enough. Whatever her reasoning, she had possessed enough confidence in her position to ask my brother to exclude his own sister, and my brother had agreed without apparently experiencing enough conflict about the decision to warn me it was happening. I thought back to the 2 times I had met Vanessa, searching for clues I might have missed about the dynamic that was forming. The first meeting had been nearly a year ago, shortly after Marcus told our parents he was dating someone seriously. He had invited me to join them for dinner at a restaurant in downtown Portland, one of those places with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and a menu that described every ingredient's geographic origin. Vanessa had arrived 15 minutes late, making an entrance that felt rehearsed, apologizing breathlessly about traffic while somehow managing to look flawless despite her supposed rush. She had been polite during dinner, asking questions about my work with the kind of surface interest that people employ when they are performing curiosity rather than feeling it. I worked as a data analyst for an environmental nonprofit, a job that mattered to me but that I had learned did not impress people who measured success by more conventional metrics like salary and status. Vanessa worked in marketing for a luxury skincare brand, a position she described with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she found it deeply meaningful to help wealthy people select expensive face creams. The dinner had been pleasant enough on the surface, but I had noticed small things that created a subtle sense of unease. The way Vanessa touched Marcus's arm frequently, as if marking territory. The way she redirected conversations that did not center her experience back to topics where she could dominate. The way she described people in terms of their usefulness to her, sorting the world into those who could advance her ambitions and those who were irrelevant to her goals. I had left that dinner with a vague sense that Vanessa viewed relationships transactionally, that she was someone who kept careful accounting of what people could offer her, and adjusted her investment in them accordingly. But I had assumed that my position as Marcus's sister would grant me some baseline level of courtesy, regardless of whether Vanessa found me personally impressive or useful. I had been wrong. The second meeting had been 4 months later, at our parents' house for a Sunday dinner that Vanessa had essentially commandeered to discuss wedding planning. She had arrived with a 3-ring binder containing fabric swatches, invitation mock-ups, and a detailed spreadsheet showing the budget breakdown for every element of the wedding. She had transformed our parents' dining room into a war room for event planning, spreading materials across every available surface while holding court about the agonizing decisions she faced regarding chair covers and signature cocktails. I had tried to participate in the conversation, offering opinions when asked in genuine enthusiasm for elements that seemed important to her. But I had noticed that my contributions were consistently met with polite smiles that did not reach Vanessa's eyes, acknowledgments that made it clear my input was tolerated rather than valued. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At one point during that dinner, Marcus had been in the kitchen helping our father with something, leaving Vanessa and me briefly alone with my mother. Vanessa had been showing us photos of potential bridesmaid dresses when my mother had made a casual comment, something like, "Oh, Maya would look lovely in that color." Vanessa's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, a brief tightening around her eyes that suggested my mother had said something inappropriate. "Actually," Vanessa had said carefully, "I have already selected my bridesmaids. They are all girls I have known since college. It is important to me that the bridal party is cohesive, people who really understand my vision and can support me emotionally through the process." The message had been clear enough. I was not included in the inner circle. I was not someone she trusted to understand her vision or provide adequate emotional support. I was, at best, a peripheral figure whose connection to the groom was insufficient to earn me a meaningful role in the celebration. I had not thought much about that moment at the time, had assumed it was simply Vanessa's preference to surround herself with her own friends rather than incorporating family members she barely knew. I had not realized it was evidence of a broader intention to minimize my presence in her new life with Marcus, to establish from the beginning that I would not be considered essential to their story, that my relationship with my brother would be subordinate to the relationship she was creating with him. Looking back now with the clarity that comes from being entirely excluded, I could see how that dinner had been a preview of what was coming. Vanessa had been testing boundaries, seeing whether anyone would push back against her implicit message that I did not belong in the center of this narrative. My mother had not pushed back. My father had not pushed back. Marcus had not pushed back. And so Vanessa had learned that she could draw increasingly restrictive circles around who mattered and who did not, and nobody would challenge her right to place me outside those circles. I finally drove home from the grocery store parking lot, leaving the ruined groceries in the trunk, because I could not summon the energy to care about melted ice cream or spoiled produce. My apartment felt different when I walked inside, as if the space itself had absorbed the knowledge that I had been excluded from something essential. I lived in a small one-bedroom in southeast Portland, nothing impressive but mine, filled with books and plants and the accumulated evidence of a life I had built deliberately and carefully after college. I had moved to Portland for graduate school 6 years ago, drawn by the city's reputation for environmental consciousness and the opportunity to work in my field without the crushing cost of living that made other West Coast cities inaccessible. I had stayed because I had created community here, had found work that felt meaningful, had built relationships with people who valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with family obligation or social performance. My relationship with Marcus had always been complicated by distance, both geographical and temperamental. He was 4 years older than me, enough of an age gap that we had never been particularly close as children. He had been the golden child, the one who excelled at sports and socializing, who collected friends effortlessly and navigated social hierarchies with natural ease. I had been the quiet one, the reader, the one who preferred small gatherings to large parties and deep conversations to surface-level banter. Our parents had loved us both, I believe that, but they had understood Marcus in ways they never quite understood me. His successes made sense to them, were legible in ways that my successes were not. When he got into a good business school, they had celebrated with a kind of unrestrained pride that made it clear this achievement confirmed everything they had hoped for him. When I got into graduate school for environmental science, they had been pleased but slightly puzzled, as if I had chosen to pursue something admirable but slightly impractical, like becoming a professional violinist or a documentary filmmaker. Marcus had moved to Seattle after business school, taking a job with a tech company that paid him more money than I would probably earn in 5 years of nonprofit work. He had bought a condo in a trendy neighborhood, had started collecting expensive hobbies like road cycling and craft cocktail mixing, had gradually transformed into someone whose life looked perfect on social media, even as our actual relationship became increasingly superficial. We texted occasionally, brief exchanges about holidays or birthdays, surface-level check-ins that never progressed to real conversations. We saw each other perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, usually at family gatherings orchestrated by our parents, events where we performed sibling affection for an audience while having almost nothing substantive to say to each other in private moments. I had told myself this distance was natural, normal, even the predictable result of siblings growing into different lives in different cities with different priorities. I had not realized the distance was also preparing the ground for my complete erasure from his most important life event. If we barely talked anyway, if we barely knew each other anymore, then perhaps it made sense in some terrible logic to simply leave me out entirely rather than including me as an obligation neither of us would enjoy. Except that logic only worked if you ignored the fundamental fact that I was his sister, that we shared history and family and a connection that should have meant something regardless of how often we texted or how different our lives had become. I called my best friend Jenna, needing to talk to someone who would understand why this hurt so much. Jenna answered on the second ring, immediately sensing from my voice that something was wrong. I told her everything, the Instagram discovery, the conversation with my mother, the mounting realization that my exclusion had been deliberate and coordinated. Jenna listened without interrupting, a skill she had perfected over years of friendship, knowing that sometimes what people need is not advice or solutions, but simply witness to their pain. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Maya," she said carefully, "I need you to hear something and I need you to really let it land. Your family did not accidentally forget to invite you. They made a choice, probably multiple choices, to exclude you and then to hide that exclusion from you. That is not a miscommunication. That is not a logistical oversight. That is deliberate harm." Her words should have made me feel worse, but instead they brought a strange sense of relief. Someone was naming the truth clearly, without softening or justifying it, without trying to preserve my family's reputation at the expense of my legitimate hurt. Jenna continued, "You need to decide what you are going to do with this information. You can pretend it did not happen, accept whatever weak explanations they eventually offer, and continue participating in a family dynamic where you are clearly not valued equally. Or you can demand accountability. You can insist on the truth. You can refuse to let them rewrite this as something innocent or unavoidable." She paused. "But you need to know that demanding accountability will probably make things worse before they get better. Some people, when confronted with evidence of their own cruelty, double down rather than apologize. They will make you the problem for refusing to accept their treatment gracefully." I knew she was right. I knew that confronting Marcus directly, insisting on explanations and accountability, would likely result in defensiveness and recrimination. He would tell me I was overreacting. He would accuse me of making his wedding about myself. He would find ways to blame me for being hurt by his choice to exclude me without invitation or explanation. But the alternative was to swallow this, to pretend I had not noticed or did not care, to show up at future family gatherings and act as if nothing had happened while everyone else moved forward having shared an experience I was deliberately prevented from witnessing. That alternative felt impossible. It felt like agreeing to my own erasure, consenting to being treated as optional in my own family. I am going to confront him, I told Jenna. I do not know exactly what I am going to say yet, but I am not going to pretend this is okay. Jenna made a sound of approval. Good. You deserve better than this, Maya. You have always deserved better than this. And maybe it is time your family heard that from you directly instead of just assuming you will keep accepting whatever they decide to give you. We talked for another hour. Jenna helping me process not just the immediate crisis but the patterns underneath it, the history that made this particular betrayal possible. She reminded me of other times my family had treated my needs and feelings as less important than Marcus's comfort or preferences. The time they had canceled plans to help me move, because Marcus had a work crisis and needed support. The time they had missed my graduate school graduation because it conflicted with a vacation they had planned to visit Marcus in Seattle. The countless small moments when my accomplishments were acknowledged briefly before conversations pivoted back to whatever Marcus was doing. I needed to trace the history that made this particular betrayal possible, to understand how we had arrived at a point where my brother could exclude me from his wedding, and then defend that exclusion as a reasonable choice rather than a fundamental violation of family bonds. The pattern, I realized as I thought back over our shared history, had been present since childhood, though its contours had shifted as we grew older. Marcus had always occupied a central position in our family system, not through any deliberate cruelty on his part, but through the simple fact that his personality and interests aligned more naturally with what our parents understood and valued. He had been athletic and social, comfortable in groups, skilled at reading social dynamics and positioning himself advantageously within them. I had been quieter, more introverted, more interested in ideas than in popularity. Our parents had loved us both, I genuinely believed that, but they had understood Marcus in ways they struggled to understand me. When Marcus excelled at soccer in middle school, our parents had attended every game, had organized their weekends around tournament schedules, had filled our living room with trophies that commemorated his achievements. When I won regional science fairs or qualified for advanced academic programs, our parents had been pleased but somehow less engaged, as if they recognized these accomplishments were impressive without quite grasping what they meant or why they mattered. The disparity had not felt malicious at the time. It had simply felt like the natural order of things, like Marcus was the sun around which the family orbited while I was a more distant planet, loved but peripheral, included but not central. As we moved into high school, the pattern became more pronounced. Marcus had been popular in ways that made our parents proud, dating girls they found charming, attending parties at houses belonging to families they knew from the country club, building a social network that reinforced their sense of having raised a successful son. I had been involved in environmental clubs and academic competitions, activities our parents supported in principle while finding them slightly opaque in practice. They came to some of my events, took some photographs, expressed some pride, but always with a quality of slight bewilderment, as if they were not entirely sure what they were celebrating or why it mattered as much as I seemed to think it did. The difference in how our achievements were received created a subtle, but persistent message about whose successes were more valuable, whose interests were more legitimate, whose life trajectory made more sense. When Marcus was accepted to a well-known business school, our parents had thrown a party, inviting extended family and friends to celebrate this validation of everything they had hoped he would become. When I was accepted to graduate school with a full fellowship to study environmental data systems, our parents had taken me out to dinner, just the three of us, a pleasant evening that ended early because they had other commitments. The contrast was not dramatic enough to protest, not obvious enough to name as favoritism, but it was real enough to shape my understanding of where I stood in the family hierarchy. That understanding had calcified during my college years when I began to recognize that the pattern was not just about parental attention but about how Marcus himself viewed our relationship. He had been friendly when we interacted, warm even, but his warmth had the quality of someone being kind to a younger acquaintance rather than invested in a sibling bond. He remembered my birthday most years, usually texting a generic greeting that could have been sent to anyone. He asked about my life in the cursory way that people ask when they know they should but do not particularly want detailed answers. He included me in family gatherings when our parents organized them but made no effort to maintain connection beyond those obligatory occasions. I had told myself this distance was normal for siblings with a significant age gap, that we simply existed in different life stages, and would reconnect more meaningfully once we were both established adults. I had assumed that as children became less central to our lives, and we developed our own independent identities, we would find new ground for relationship beyond childhood proximity. I had been wrong. The distance had not closed as we aged. It had widened. Marcus had built a life in Seattle that did not include me, had formed friendships and romantic relationships that did not reference me, had created a narrative about himself that apparently did not require acknowledgement of a sister who lived in Portland working in a field he did not understand for an income he would consider inadequate. When he had started dating Vanessa 2 years ago, I had hoped her entrance into his life might create opportunities for renewed connection. Perhaps family would become more important to him as he contemplated starting his own. Perhaps he would want to strengthen sibling bonds as he prepared to build a marriage that would eventually produce the next generation. Perhaps Vanessa herself would value family connection and encourage Marcus to maintain relationships with his relatives. I had been naive on all counts. Vanessa had not encouraged family connection. She had evaluated me according to criteria I could never have known I was being judged against, had found me wanting in ways I still did not fully understand, and had apparently convinced Marcus that excluding me entirely was preferable to including me in ways that might dilute her vision of their perfect wedding day. That first dinner where I had met Vanessa, the evening I had dismissed at the time as simply awkward, now revealed itself as something more calculated. Vanessa had been assessing me, determining whether I fit into the aesthetic and social framework she was constructing around her life with Marcus. I had failed that assessment, though I could not pinpoint the exact moment of failure or the specific criteria I had violated. Perhaps my work was too unglamorous, too focused on environmental issues that did not align with her luxury brand marketing worldview. Perhaps my appearance was too casual, my wardrobe too practical, my entire presentation insufficiently polished for someone who spent professional hours considering how to sell expensive face creams to wealthy consumers. Perhaps my conversational style was too direct, too willing to express genuine opinions, rather than reflecting back whatever the dominant personality in the room wanted to hear. Whatever the specific failures, Vanessa had concluded that I was not someone who would enhance her wedding narrative, not someone whose presence would contribute to the carefully curated aesthetic she was creating. And Marcus, rather than defending me or even acknowledging that his sister might deserve inclusion regardless of whether I met his fiancée's standards for guest list worthiness, had accepted her assessment without apparent conflict. He had agreed that I should be excluded, had participated in keeping that exclusion secret, and was now defending the decision as if it were obviously reasonable rather than a profound betrayal of sibling relationship. The second dinner at our parents' house, the event I had also dismissed as merely uncomfortable, now appeared as evidence that the exclusion plan was already in motion. Vanessa's comment about her bridesmaids being girls who understood her vision, delivered in response to my mother's casual suggestion that I might wear a particular dress color, had been a boundary statement disguised as wedding planning preference. She had been establishing that I would have no meaningful role in the wedding, testing whether anyone would challenge her right to structure the event entirely according to her preferences, even when those preferences meant excluding immediate family members. Nobody had challenged her. My mother had accepted the statement with a smile, redirecting conversation to other topics rather than asking why family relationship might not warrant some consideration in wedding planning decisions. My father had been in the kitchen and missed the exchange entirely. Marcus had been present but silent, his silence functioning as agreement that Vanessa's preferences took precedence over any consideration he might feel toward including his sister in his life's most significant celebration. I thought about all the family gatherings over the years where Marcus's needs and preferences had taken precedence over mine in ways that seemed insignificant individually, but revealed a pattern when viewed collectively. The Christmas when we had accommodated his work schedule by celebrating 2 days late, disrupting plans I had made but which were considered less important than ensuring Marcus could attend. The vacation planning sessions where destinations were selected based on Marcus's interests in craft breweries and cycling routes, rather than my preferences for hiking and environmental preservation sites. The countless conversations during family dinners that centered Marcus's career developments, his apartment renovations, his hobby acquisitions, while my work received only brief acknowledgement before topics shifted back to whatever Marcus was currently excited about. These incidents had not felt like favoritism at the time because they had been framed as practical accommodations, reasonable adjustments to ensure family harmony and maximize everyone's ability to participate. But practical accommodations that consistently flow in one direction cease being accommodation and become hierarchy, an unspoken agreement that one person's preferences matter more than another's, that one person's time and interest deserve priority while another person's needs can be subordinated whenever convenient. Marcus had learned from these patterns that he could expect accommodation, that his choices would be supported, that his vision of how things should be would generally prevail. I had learned that my role was to adapt, to be flexible, to make space for what Marcus needed or wanted without expecting reciprocal consideration. The wedding exclusion was not an aberration from this pattern, but its logical culmination. If I had spent years making space for Marcus's preferences, accommodating his schedule, subordinating my needs to his priorities, then why would he imagine I would object to being excluded from his wedding? Why would he anticipate that this particular accommodation might finally exceed what I was willing to accept? From his perspective, shaped by years of my acquiescence, the exclusion was probably another reasonable request for flexibility, another situation where I should understand that his needs took precedence and adjust my expectations accordingly. The fact that those needs had escalated to complete erasure from his wedding day was just a difference in degree rather than kind, a larger version of the small exclusions I had been accepting for years. I recognized, sitting in that hallway outside my meeting room, that I had been complicit in establishing the dynamic that made the wedding exclusion possible. Not complicit in the sense of deserving what had happened to me, but complicit in the sense of never clearly articulating that the pattern was unacceptable, never drawing boundaries around what I would tolerate, never demanding reciprocity or equality in how we treated each other's needs and priorities. I had stayed quiet when my graduate school graduation was treated as less important than a vacation to visit Marcus. I had said nothing when Christmas was rescheduled to accommodate his work schedule, while my work schedule was never consulted. I had smiled through family dinners that centered his life while treating mine as brief updates before returning to more compelling topics. My silence had not been weakness exactly. It had been strategy, an attempt to preserve family relationships by not creating conflict, by being the easy child who did not demand attention or cause problems. But what I had understood as conflict avoidance had actually been conflict deferral, storing up resentments and hurts that would eventually demand acknowledgement. The wedding exclusion had simply forced that acknowledgement to arrive sooner and more dramatically than it might have otherwise. Marcus had finally made a choice so egregious that I could not rationalize it away, could not minimize it as a minor slight, could not convince myself that staying silent was preferable to naming what had been done to me. I thought about Jenna's words from our earlier conversation, her observation that some people double down when confronted with evidence of their cruelty, rather than apologizing. Marcus's email suggested he was one of those people. Rather than acknowledging he had hurt me and examining why he had made choices that caused that hurt, he had constructed a defensive narrative that positioned him as someone making difficult but reasonable decisions while I was someone overreacting to normal wedding planning constraints. He had not engaged with the actual issue, which was not whether guest lists require limits but whether those limits should extend to excluding immediate family members without even informing them the wedding was happening. He had not addressed why Vanessa's hypothetical concerns about drama outweighed his actual relationship with his sister or why he had never asked me directly whether I would cause the problem she imagined. The email had been an invitation to accept his narrative and move forward without further discussion. I could respond by agreeing that I understood the decisions were difficult, that I respected his right to structure his wedding as he chose, that I harbored no ongoing hurt about my exclusion. I could perform reconciliation without requiring any actual accountability, could restore surface-level family harmony by pretending the wound had not been deep. That approach would be easier for everyone, would allow us to attend future family gatherings without awkwardness, would preserve the fiction that we were a functional family unit, rather than a collection of people performing family, while maintaining carefully managed distances. But taking that approach would require me to accept that my feelings mattered less than everyone else's comfort, that maintaining pleasant surfaces was more important than addressing genuine harm, that I should once again subordinate my legitimate needs to what was convenient for my family. It would require me to agree that Marcus's right to a drama-free wedding superseded my right to basic inclusion and respect. I had always told myself these incidents were isolated, that my parents loved us equally even if they expressed that love differently. But isolated incidents, when you added them together, became patterns. Patterns became systems. Systems became identities, roles we were each assigned and expected to perform. Marcus was the successful one, the one whose life trajectory made sense to our parents, whose choices they understood and celebrated. I was the other one, the one doing something interesting but somewhat opaque, whose life they supported in abstract principle while never quite engaging with in concrete practice. Marcus's wedding, the culmination of years of subtle prioritization, had simply made that system explicit and undeniable. After I hung up with Jenna, I sat with my laptop and began typing an email to Marcus. I did not want to have this conversation over text, where tone could be misread and responses could be delayed indefinitely, but I also did not trust myself to remain composed during a phone call. Email gave me the structure I needed, the ability to say precisely what I meant without being derailed by interruptions or deflections. I wrote carefully, revising multiple times before I felt I had captured what needed to be said. The final version was direct without being cruel, honest without being accusatory, clear about my hurt without begging for sympathy I should not have to request. I explained that I had seen the wedding photos on Instagram. I explained that I had confirmed with our mother that the exclusion had been deliberate rather than accidental. I explained that I needed to understand why he had made this choice, why I had been deemed unworthy of even knowing the wedding was happening, much less attending it. I explained that his silence over the past 3 weeks, his apparent comfort with allowing me to remain ignorant of this major life event, had damaged our relationship in ways I was still processing. I told him I deserved an explanation, not because I expected it would repair what had been broken, but because I deserved the basic respect of understanding what had been done to me and why. I read the email through one final time, my finger hovering over the send button. Part of me wanted to delete it, to protect myself from whatever response might come, to preserve the possibility that this had all been some terrible misunderstanding that could still be resolved with minimal conflict. But I knew that possibility did not exist. This was real. This had happened. And pretending otherwise would only compound the harm by forcing me to participate in my own erasure. I pressed send and watched the email disappear from my outbox, carrying with it a question that would force my brother to either offer truth or reveal himself as someone willing to cause harm without accepting responsibility for it. Either way, I would know where I stood. Either way, I would have to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I was willing to maintain with people who had demonstrated so clearly that they did not consider me essential to their lives. The rest of that evening passed in a strange suspended state, as if time had slowed while I waited for the consequences of demanding truth to reveal themselves. I kept checking my phone compulsively, watching for the notification that would indicate Marcus had read my email and chosen to respond. Nothing came. Hours passed. I made dinner I could not eat. I tried to read but could not focus on the words. I finally went to bed knowing that tomorrow would bring either explanation or further silence, and that either outcome would require me to make decisions about how much I was willing to accept from people who had shown me exactly how much they valued my presence in their lives. Marcus responded to my email 36 hours later. A delay that felt calculated rather than accidental. The response arrived on a Wednesday afternoon while I was in a meeting about water quality monitoring protocols, my phone buzzing against the conference table with enough insistence that I knew something significant had arrived. I excused myself and read his message in the hallway outside the meeting room, leaning against the wall for support as I processed what he had written. The email was shorter than mine had been, less detailed, more defensive. He opened by saying he understood I was upset, a framing that immediately positioned my legitimate hurt as an emotional overreaction rather than a reasonable response to genuine harm. He explained that the wedding had been small and intimate, limited to immediate family and close friends, though the Instagram photos clearly showed at least 200 guests assembled under that rose-covered arch. He claimed that he and Vanessa had made difficult decisions about the guest list, that they could not invite everyone they might have wanted to include, that these choices had nothing to do with how much he valued our relationship. The explanation was generic enough to apply to any excluded acquaintance, any distant cousin or former colleague who might reasonably be left off a wedding invitation due to space constraints or budget limitations. It contained no acknowledgement that I was not a distant acquaintance but his only sibling, no recognition that excluding immediate family required justification beyond standard wedding planning considerations. The email treated my exclusion as equivalent to not inviting his dentist or his accountant, as if blood relation and shared history created no special obligation to at least inform me the wedding was happening even if I could not attend. Near the end of the message, Marcus added a single line that felt like the only honest thing he had written. He said that Vanessa had concerns about potential drama at the wedding, that she wanted the day to be peaceful and focused on celebration, rather than complicated family dynamics. He did not elaborate on what drama he imagined I might create or what complicated family dynamics he was referencing. He did not explain why he had accepted Vanessa's assessment of me as a potential source of disruption, rather than defending me as someone who would obviously support his happiness on his wedding day. He simply stated her concern as if it were self-evidently reasonable, as if I should understand and accept that his fiancée's hypothetical anxiety about my presence outweighed any obligation he might feel toward his sister. I read the email 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of what was not being said. Marcus had not apologized for excluding me. He had not apologized for failing to tell me about the wedding beforehand or inform me afterward. He had not acknowledged any wrongdoing at all, had instead constructed a narrative in which difficult but necessary decisions had been made by well-meaning people trying to create a perfect day, and I was being unreasonable for taking those decisions personally. The email invited me to accept this narrative, to agree that my hurt was disproportionate to the circumstances, to move forward without requiring anything more than this minimal explanation from him. I did not respond immediately. I needed time to process not just what Marcus had written, but what his message revealed about how he understood our relationship and his obligations within it. I needed to recognize that this was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of patterns that had been building for years. Patterns I had noticed but never fully confronted, because confrontation felt dangerous and acceptance felt safer. It would require me to internalize the message that I was someone whose exclusion could be justified with vague references to potential problems, rather than someone whose presence should be valued and protected. I stood in that hallway making a decision that would alter the trajectory of all my family relationships. I could continue playing the role I had always played, the accommodating sister who made space for Marcus's life while minimizing her own needs and disappointments. Or I could refuse that role, could insist on being seen and valued, could demand accountability for harm even when that demand made other people uncomfortable. The first option was familiar and safe. The second option was terrifying and necessary. I returned to the conference room and finished the meeting, contributing to discussions about monitoring protocols, while part of my mind continued processing what I now understood about my family and my place within it. After work, I went home and began drafting a response to Marcus's email, taking my time to articulate what needed to be said clearly and completely. I did not want to leave room for misinterpretation or deflection. I wanted to name the pattern explicitly, to connect the wedding exclusion to the broader history that made it possible, to make clear that I was no longer willing to accept treatment that positioned me as optional or peripheral in my own family. The response took me 3 days to complete, written in sections as I processed different dimensions of what I needed to communicate. I explained that his characterization of the wedding as small and intimate was contradicted by the extensive photographic evidence showing hundreds of guests. I noted that describing Vanessa's concerns about potential drama, without specifying what drama I might cause, was a way of casting aspersions on my character, without making concrete claims he would need to defend. I pointed out that excluding me was not equivalent to limiting the invitation list to close friends and family, since I was immediate family, the closest family relationship beyond our parents who had been included without apparent concern about drama. I traced the history of accommodation and prioritization, explaining how years of small decisions that favored Marcus's preferences had created a dynamic where he apparently felt entitled to exclude me from major life events without expecting consequences. I acknowledged my own complicity in maintaining that dynamic through silence, but I explained that my previous silence should not be interpreted as consent for escalating mistreatment. I clarified that I was not asking him to retroactively invite me to his wedding or pretend the exclusion had not happened. I was asking him to acknowledge that he had made a choice that hurt me, that the choice was not justified by standard wedding planning limitations, and that continuing our relationship would require him to examine why he found it acceptable to treat his sister as someone whose feelings did not warrant consideration. I ended the email by saying I needed space to process what his choices revealed about how he viewed our relationship, that I would not be attending family gatherings in the near future because I needed distance from a family system that had demonstrated so clearly how little it valued my presence. I explained that this was not a dramatic ultimatum but rather a boundary necessary for my own well-being, that I was not asking him to choose between me and Vanessa but rather informing him that I was choosing to protect myself from further harm by limiting my exposure to people who had shown they would prioritize convenience over kindness when those values came into conflict. I sent the email on a Friday evening and then put my phone in a drawer, not wanting to obsessively check for responses that might not come, or that might cause further hurt when they did arrive. I spent the weekend with Jenna and other friends who knew my story, and did not require me to perform wellness or acceptance before I had genuinely processed the situation. We hiked in the Columbia River Gorge, the physical exertion and natural beauty, providing the kind of restoration that comes from temporarily setting aside human complications in favor of older rhythms and more fundamental realities. Marcus did not respond to that email. Neither did my parents, though I had not sent them the exchange directly, trusting that Marcus would share whatever version of events served his narrative purposes. The silence felt different this time. Not like abandonment but like confirmation. They had received my clear articulation of harm and chose not to engage with it, chose to let my boundaries stand rather than challenge their own behavior or assumptions. That choice told me everything I needed to know about whether the relationship patterns could change, and whether my family members possessed the capacity for the kind of honest examination that real repair would require. The silence from my family following my second email created space for reflection that I had not previously allowed myself. Without the constant negotiation of their expectations and the mental energy required to maintain relationships that demanded so much while offering so little, I found myself thinking more clearly about how the patterns had begun, about the earliest moments when I had learned my role within our family structure. Understanding the foundation, I realized, was essential to understanding why the wedding exclusion had felt simultaneously shocking and somehow inevitable, a betrayal that surprised me even as it confirmed suspicions I had been suppressing for years. My earliest memories of family life were dominated by Marcus, though not because he was deliberately cruel or attention-seeking as a child. He was simply 4 years older, which meant he reached every milestone first, commanded more sophisticated attention, and naturally occupied more space in our parents' awareness. When I was learning to walk, Marcus was learning to read. When I was learning to read, Marcus was joining his first sports team. When I was joining sports teams, Marcus was navigating the complex social world of middle school. The age gap created a permanent condition where whatever I was doing felt less impressive because Marcus had already done it, and whatever Marcus was doing felt more important because it represented new territory our parents were navigating for the first time. I did not experience this as unfair when I was very young. Children do not possess sophisticated frameworks for analyzing family dynamics. They simply absorb what is modeled and assume that their particular experience represents universal reality. I thought all families worked this way, with older siblings receiving more attention and younger siblings learning to find satisfaction in whatever space remained after the older child's needs were addressed. I thought it was normal that conversations at dinner centered on Marcus's day at school, while my contributions were acknowledged briefly before adults returned to discussing whatever complicated social situation Marcus was navigating. I thought it was normal that my parents' anxiety and investment focused primarily on Marcus's development, while my own progress was monitored more casually, with less intensity and lower stakes. The physical organization of our house reflected and reinforced these priorities. The main hallway leading from the living room to the bedrooms was lined with framed photographs, a gallery that documented our family's most important moments. The photographs were not distributed evenly between Marcus and me. They clustered more heavily around his accomplishments and milestones. There were multiple shots from his various soccer seasons, action photos where he appeared mid-kick or mid-celebration, his face intense with focus or bright with victory. There were photographs from academic awards ceremonies where he stood on stages holding certificates or trophies, dressed in clothes our mother had carefully selected to ensure he looked appropriately accomplished. There were candid shots from family vacations where Marcus appeared confident and comfortable, posed against backdrops our parents had chosen specifically to create memorable images. My photographs existed in that hallway too, but they occupied less prominent positions and documented less dramatic moments. There was my kindergarten portrait, standard school photography that every child received regardless of particular achievement. There was a picture from a piano recital where I sat at the bench looking serious and slightly uncomfortable, an image that captured competence but not triumph. There was a family photo from a beach vacation where I appeared in the background while Marcus stood in the foreground building an elaborate sandcastle, the composition unintentionally but clearly establishing hierarchy even in supposedly neutral family documentation. I remember standing in that hallway as a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, studying the photographs and trying to understand what they communicated about who we were as a family. I had not yet developed language for concepts like favoritism or differential treatment, but I could sense that the visual record told a story where Marcus was the protagonist, and I was a supporting character, present but not central, included but not essential to the narrative. I had wondered, in the vague way children wonder about things they lack frameworks to articulate, whether the photograph distribution meant Marcus was more important than me, whether his achievements mattered more than mine, whether I needed to accomplish something so impressive that it would earn prominent hallway placement. That wondering had shaped my approach to achievement throughout childhood. I had sought activities and accomplishments that might capture my parents' attention with the same intensity that Marcus's successes did. I had tried soccer first, the obvious choice since it had worked so well for Marcus, but I had discovered quickly that I lacked both his natural athleticism and his comfort with the aggressive competition the sport required. I had been a competent player but not an exceptional one, and competence without exceptionalism did not generate the kind of parental excitement I was seeking. My parents had attended my games dutifully, standing on sidelines with other parents, but they had not exhibited the intense engagement they brought to Marcus's matches, had not analyzed my performance afterward or discussed strategy for improvement, had not seemed to view my soccer participation as particularly significant beyond being a healthy activity that kept me busy and social. I had abandoned soccer after 2 seasons and tried other approaches to earning the attention I wanted. I had joined the school science club and discovered that I genuinely enjoyed the process of designing experiments, collecting data, and drawing conclusions from evidence. I had been good at it, good enough to place well in regional competitions, good enough that my teachers had encouraged me to pursue advanced science opportunities. But my parents' response to these achievements had been qualitatively different from their response to Marcus's athletic triumphs. They had been pleased, certainly, had congratulated me and displayed participation certificates on the refrigerator, but they had not understood what I was doing well enough to be genuinely excited about it. Science fair projects were abstract to them in ways that soccer goals were not. They could see Marcus score and understand immediately that something impressive had occurred. They could see my trifold board displaying experimental methodology and results without grasping why it was noteworthy, or what it represented about my capabilities. This comprehension gap had created a subtle but persistent sense that my accomplishments existed in a different category than Marcus's, that his successes were objectively impressive, while mine were niche achievements that mattered to specialized audiences, but not to regular people. The message was never stated explicitly. My parents never said that science was less valuable than sports, or that my interests were inferior to Marcus's. But the message was communicated through attention patterns, through the emotional energy they brought to different activities, through how they described our achievements to friends and extended family. When people asked about their children, my parents would light up describing Marcus's latest soccer tournament or academic award, speaking with detailed knowledge and obvious pride. When they mentioned my activities, their descriptions were shorter and vaguer, conveying that I was doing well in school and involved in various programs but without the specificity that suggested deep engagement with what I was actually accomplishing. I had adapted to this reality by becoming strategically self-sufficient. If my parents were not going to provide the kind of detailed engagement and enthusiastic support that Marcus received, then I would learn to generate my own motivation and validation. I had developed the ability to assess my own work critically, to set my own goals, to feel satisfaction from meeting standards I had established for myself, rather than waiting for external recognition. This adaptation had served me well in many ways, had made me independent and internally driven, had taught me not to require constant praise or validation to persist in pursuing goals I found meaningful. But it had also meant that I spent my childhood somewhat isolated within my own family, operating in a parallel track where I pursued my interests and they pursued theirs, with limited intersection or mutual understanding. The divergence between Marcus's experience and mine had become more pronounced as we entered adolescence. Marcus had navigated the social complexities of middle school and high school with apparent ease, collecting friends and romantic interests without visible effort. He had been invited to parties, included in social groups, recognized as someone whose presence enhanced any gathering. Our parents had been fascinated by his social success, had asked detailed questions about his friendships, had met his friends and remembered their names and family backgrounds, had created space for him to host gatherings at our house where they could observe his social world and feel connected to it. My social life had been smaller and quieter, organized around a few close friendships with other academically focused students who preferred deep conversations to large parties, who would rather spend weekend afternoons hiking or visiting museums than attending the social events that define teenage status hierarchies. My parents had been less interested in this social world, had treated my friendships as pleasant but not particularly significant, had not invested the same energy in knowing my friends or facilitating my social activities. They had not been opposed to my friendships or dismissive of them exactly. They had simply found them less compelling, less worthy of their attention and engagement, than Marcus's more extensive and conventional social network. The differential treatment had extended to how our emerging personalities were interpreted and valued. Marcus's confidence was praised as leadership potential. My thoughtfulness was sometimes characterized as excessive seriousness, as if my tendency to think carefully before speaking or acting was a limitation rather than a strength. Marcus's social ease was celebrated as charisma. My preference for smaller gatherings was occasionally pathologized as social anxiety, though I had never experienced my introversion as anxiety, but simply as a natural preference for depth over breadth in relationships. Marcus's interest in business and entrepreneurship was understood as ambitious and practical. My interest in environmental science was acknowledged as admirable but also viewed as somewhat idealistic, as if caring about ecological systems and data-driven conservation represented a phase I might outgrow rather than a genuine calling I was pursuing. These interpretations had shaped how I understood myself and my place within the family structure. I had learned that certain kinds of personalities and interests were more valued than others, that some ways of being in the world earned enthusiastic support, while others earned polite tolerance. I had learned that my parents' capacity for understanding and celebrating their children was not infinite or equally distributed, that they had limited emotional bandwidth and most of it was directed toward the child whose life made sense to them in immediate, legible ways. I had learned that expecting equal treatment or comparable investment was unrealistic, that I needed to adjust my expectations to match what they were actually capable of providing rather than what I wished they would provide. The adjustment had required me to develop alternative sources of validation and belonging. I had found teachers who recognized my capabilities and encouraged my development in ways my parents did not. I had found friends whose families welcomed me and showed interest in my thoughts and accomplishments. I had found activities and communities where my particular strengths were valued rather than tolerated. These alternative sources had been crucial for my development, had prevented me from internalizing the message that I was somehow deficient simply because my particular configuration of interests and personality did not align with what my parents found most comprehensible or compelling. But the existence of these alternative sources had not eliminated the pain of not receiving comparable support and recognition from my own family. Children are remarkably adaptable, capable of finding creative solutions to less than ideal circumstances. But that adaptability does not mean the circumstances cease being less than ideal, or that the adaptation comes without cost. I had adapted successfully to being the less prioritized child, had built a sense of self that did not depend entirely on parental validation, but that adaptation had required me to create distance between my authentic self and the version of myself I performed in family contexts. At home, I had learned to be smaller, quieter, less demanding of attention or engagement. I had learned to present my accomplishments modestly, to downplay my needs, to make space for Marcus's more expansive presence without appearing resentful or bitter about the imbalance. This performance had become so habitual that I had sometimes lost track of where the performance ended and my authentic self began. I had genuinely believed, for long stretches of my childhood and adolescence, that I was naturally someone who did not need much attention, who was content with minimal recognition, who preferred to operate independently rather than seeking involvement and support from others. It was only later, in college and beyond, When I encountered relationships where people actively wanted to know me and engage with my life, that I had recognized how much of my childhood self-sufficiency had been adaptation rather than authentic preference. I had been capable of operating independently because I had needed to be, not because independence was my natural state or deepest desire. The recognition had been both liberating and painful. Liberating because it meant that my hunger for recognition and belonging was not excessive or unreasonable, but rather a natural human need that had been inadequately met during my formative years. Painful because it meant acknowledging that my family had failed to provide something essential, that my childhood had been marked by a deprivation I had worked hard not to recognize as deprivation. It was easier to believe I was naturally independent and self-sufficient than to admit I had been forced into independence, because dependence on my parents for emotional support and validation would have meant constant disappointment. These childhood patterns had established templates that persisted into adulthood, even as the specific content changed. The fundamental dynamic remained constant, with Marcus occupying a central position in family attention and priority, while I orbited at a greater distance, included but not essential, acknowledged but not celebrated. The wedding exclusion had simply made that dynamic explicit and undeniable, had removed the polite fictions that allowed us all to pretend we were a normally functioning family with normal patterns of love and loyalty. The exclusion had forced me to see clearly what I had been avoiding seeing, to name what I had been unwilling to name, to recognize that the patterns established in childhood had not resolved or diminished as we became adults but had instead calcified into permanent structures that would shape our relationships indefinitely unless someone actively disrupted them. I thought about the younger version of myself, standing in that hallway studying photographs and wondering what I needed to accomplish to earn prominent placement in the family narrative. I wished I could speak to that child, could explain that the photograph distribution was not about her worth or her accomplishments but about her parents' limitations and her brother's alignment with what they found comprehensible. I wished I could tell her that she did not need to keep trying different activities hoping to find the one that would finally capture their sustained attention, that their limited engagement was about them rather than her, that she deserved adults who would work to understand her rather than requiring her to conform to what they already understood. But I could not speak to that younger self. I could only speak to my current self, the adult woman who had finally recognized the patterns clearly enough to name them and assert boundaries around what she would continue to accept. That recognition had been painful but also clarifying. It had allowed me to stop blaming myself for the distance in my family relationships, to stop believing that if I just found the right approach or accomplished the right things I could earn the kind of engaged support and recognition that came naturally to Marcus. It had allowed me to recognize that the problem was not my inadequacy, but rather a systemic pattern of differential treatment that had begun before I was old enough to understand what was happening, and had continued, because everyone involved had reasons to maintain the status quo rather than disrupt it. The weeks following my email to Marcus became a period of intensive self-examination and pattern recognition. I found myself revisiting memories I had not thought about in years, seeing them now with the clarity that comes from finally possessing adequate frameworks for understanding what had actually been happening. The time my parents had missed my middle school science fair, because it conflicted with one of Marcus's soccer tournaments. The summer they had sent me to sleepaway camp for 3 weeks while keeping Marcus home because he had expressed ambivalence about going, the asymmetry of whose preferences determined family decisions never explicitly discussed. The college selection process where they had visited multiple campuses with Marcus, helping him evaluate options and think through decisions, while I had researched and applied to schools largely independently because they had seemed to assume I was capable of managing the process without their involvement. Each recovered memory added another piece to the mosaic, another data point confirming that what I had experienced was not a series of isolated incidents, but a sustained pattern of differential treatment. The pattern had not been dramatic enough to constitute obvious abuse or neglect. My parents had provided food, shelter, education, and a generally stable home environment. They had not been actively cruel or deliberately harmful, but they had consistently provided Marcus with more attention, more support, more enthusiastic engagement, and more benefit of the doubt than they provided me. They had created a family culture where his needs took precedence, his perspective was prioritized, and his comfort was protected, while my needs were addressed only after his had been satisfied. My perspective was considered only if it did not conflict with his, and my comfort was sacrificed whenever necessary to maintain his. This pattern had shaped not only how my parents treated us but how Marcus learned to view himself in our relationship. He had been raised in a system that taught him he was central, that his needs mattered most, that he could expect others to accommodate him without needing to provide reciprocal accommodation. He had not developed empathy for what it felt like to be consistently deprioritized because he had never experienced that position himself. He had not learned to consider how his choices affected me because the family system had never required him to consider that. He had been free to pursue his own interests and priorities without constraint, while I had been expected to remain flexible and accommodating, to adapt to whatever arrangements worked best for him without complaint. The wedding exclusion, viewed through this lens, was simply Marcus doing what he had always done and what the family system had always permitted him to do. He had prioritized his own comfort and his fiancée's preferences without considering how those priorities might affect me. He had assumed I would accept the exclusion the way I had accepted countless other deprioritizations throughout our shared history. He had not anticipated that this particular exclusion might finally exceed what I was willing to tolerate, that there might be limits to my capacity for accommodation that even years of conditioning had not eliminated. His surprise at my reaction suggested he had genuinely not understood that he was doing anything remarkable, that excluding his sister from his wedding might be experienced as different in kind rather than merely in degree from the smaller exclusions that had characterized our relationship all along. Understanding this helped me separate my hurt about the wedding from my hurt about the entire history that made the wedding exclusion possible. The wedding was painful, certainly, but it was painful primarily because it represented the culmination of a lifetime of similar messages about my expendability and peripheral status. If the wedding exclusion had been an isolated incident occurring within an otherwise equitable and loving relationship, it might have been possible to address it as a specific mistake, rather than as evidence of fundamental family dysfunction. But because the exclusion fit so neatly into established patterns, because it was so consistent with how I had always been treated relative to Marcus, it could not be separated from that larger history. Addressing the wedding meant addressing everything, challenging not just one decision but an entire system of relating that had been decades in the making. That realization was both daunting and necessary. It meant that reconciliation, if it were to be genuine rather than performative, would require my family members to examine patterns they had never previously questioned, to recognize harm they had not intended but had nonetheless caused, to accept responsibility for creating and maintaining a family culture that had systematically undervalued one of its members. That kind of examination is difficult under the best circumstances. It becomes nearly impossible when people have spent years defending and justifying their behavior, when acknowledging harm means confronting their own complicity in causing it, when change would require not just different future behavior but also reckoning with past harm they cannot undo or repair. I did not know whether my family possessed the capacity for that kind of examination and reckoning. I suspected they did not, suspected that the silence following my detailed email was evidence of their unwillingness to engage with the discomfort my honesty created. But I also recognized that their capacity or willingness was not something I could control or create through perfect articulation or careful explanation. I had done what I could do by naming the patterns clearly and setting boundaries around what I would continue to accept. What they chose to do with that information was their responsibility, not mine. My responsibility was to protect myself from further harm, to build a life that did not depend on their validation or inclusion, to find belonging and recognition in relationships with people who demonstrated through consistent action that they valued my presence and prioritized my well-being. The transition from childhood into adolescence marked a period when the flexible patterns of early family life hardened into fixed-role assignments that would prove remarkably resistant to change. During these formative years between ages 13 and 18, the differences in how Marcus and I were treated ceased being incidental variations and became instead a deliberate structure that organized family resources, attention, and emotional investment according to an unspoken but clearly understood hierarchy. What had once felt like natural accommodation of an older sibling's needs transformed into something more rigid and consequential, a system that would shape not only our teenage experiences, but our capacity to envision different possibilities for our adult relationships. Marcus entered high school 2 years before I did, which meant he pioneered the family's navigation of that complex social and academic terrain. Our parents had approached his high school years with intense engagement, treating each decision about course selection, extracurricular involvement, and social navigation as momentous and worthy of extended family discussion. They had attended back-to-school nights and parent-teacher conferences with careful attention, taking notes on what his teachers said and following up with questions that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding his educational experience. They had helped him evaluate which advanced placement courses to take, which clubs to join, which social opportunities to pursue. They had made his high school success a family project, something we all participated in supporting and celebrating. When Marcus joined the varsity soccer team as a sophomore, an achievement that apparently demonstrated exceptional athletic ability, since most sophomores played on junior varsity, our family schedule reorganized entirely around his game and practice commitments. Our parents attended every home game and most away games, sometimes driving 2 or 3 hours to watch him play for 90 minutes. They purchased season tickets for the family section, brought folding chairs and blankets for comfort during cold weather games, prepared thermoses of hot chocolate that we shared during halftime. They learned the names and positions of his teammates, discussed strategy and performance with the kind of detailed analysis usually reserved for professional sports, celebrated victories with restaurant dinners that sometimes included his teammates and their families. The soccer commitment shaped our family life so completely that other activities and obligations were evaluated primarily on whether they conflicted with Marcus's game schedule. Family vacations were planned around tournament calendars. Extended family gatherings were scheduled to avoid conflicts with playoff games. Even routine weekend activities were arranged to ensure nothing interfered with his ability to perform at his best, which meant adequate rest before games and appropriate recovery time afterward. The assumption that organizing family life around Marcus's athletic commitments was natural and necessary went entirely unquestioned. His success was treated as a family success, something we all had responsibility for supporting and reason for celebrating. By the time I entered high school 2 years later, the precedent had been firmly established. But the precedent did not extend to my activities with the same intensity or comprehensiveness. I had joined the Environmental Science Club and the math team, both activities that competed at regional and state levels and required similar time commitments to Marcus's soccer. But my parents' engagement with these activities was qualitatively and quantitatively different from their engagement with his athletics. They attended some competitions but not all, treating their attendance as optional rather than obligatory. They did not learn the names of my teammates or the structures of the competitions we entered. They did not reorganize family schedules to accommodate my practice times or competition dates. They expressed pleasure when I did well, but without the intense investment and detailed knowledge that characterized their relationship to Marcus's athletic achievements. The disparity became particularly evident during my sophomore year when I qualified for the State Science Olympiad competition, a significant achievement that required substantial preparation and represented recognition of capabilities that extended well beyond ordinary academic performance. The state competition was scheduled for a Saturday in April, the same weekend as one of Marcus's important soccer games. When the scheduling conflict became apparent, our parents had not treated it as a genuine dilemma, requiring careful consideration of competing priorities. They had simply assumed that my mother would attend Marcus's game with him while my father would drive me to the science competition, a solution that preserved the family's full presence at Marcus's event, while splitting parental attention for mine. I had not protested this arrangement at the time, had told myself that it was fair enough that each of us had one parent present for our respective activities. But I had noticed the asymmetry in how the conflict was resolved. The question had never been whether Marcus would have both parents at his game. That had been assumed. The only question was which parent would be designated to cover my competition, so that I would not be entirely without family support. The message embedded in that decision-making process was clear. Marcus's activities warranted full family presence. Mine warranted partial family presence, adequate to demonstrate that they cared but not substantial enough to suggest my achievements carried equivalent weight to his. This pattern repeated itself across countless situations throughout my high school years. When both of us needed rides to activities that occurred simultaneously, Marcus was driven first, and I was expected to find alternative transportation or adjust my schedule. When both of us had events worthy of celebration, Marcus's celebration was more elaborate and involved more extended family participation. When both of us needed help with schoolwork or college preparation, Marcus received more extensive parental involvement, while I was encouraged to be independent and self-sufficient. The justifications for these disparities varied, but the underlying message remained constant. His needs took precedence. His success was more important. His comfort and convenience mattered more than mine. The impact of this differential treatment extended beyond the immediate practical consequences of receiving less support or attention. It shaped my understanding of my own value and my expectations for how I should be treated in relationships. I learned that asking for equal treatment was unrealistic and potentially selfish, that accepting less than equal treatment was mature and understanding, that I should feel grateful for whatever attention and support I received rather than resentful about what was withheld. I learned to minimize my own needs and accomplishments, to present them as less significant than they were, to avoid creating situations where my achievements might draw attention away from Marcus or require my parents to make uncomfortable choices about how to allocate their finite resources of time and emotional energy. The social dimensions of high school further reinforced these patterns. Marcus had been popular in ways that made our parents proud and reinforced their sense that they had raised a successful son. He had dated several girls from families my parents knew through their social networks, relationships they had treated as appropriate and worthy of interest. They had welcomed his girlfriends into our home, made efforts to know them and make them comfortable, treated Marcus's romantic life as a legitimate area of parental interest and involvement. When one of his relationships ended badly during his junior year, leaving him temporarily despondent, they had responded with sympathy and active support, checking on him frequently and discussing strategies for emotional recovery. My social life during high school had been smaller and less conventional, organized around friendships with other academically focused students who did not occupy prominent positions in the school's social hierarchy. My parents had been less interested in these friendships, had not made equivalent efforts to know my friends or engage with my social world. When I had briefly dated someone during my junior year, a boy from my math team who shared my interests in environmental issues and data analysis, my parents had been politely supportive but not particularly engaged. They had not asked to meet him or expressed interest in learning about our relationship. When that relationship ended, they had barely noticed, had not checked on my emotional state or offered the kind of active support they had provided Marcus during his romantic disappointments. The message conveyed through these differential responses was that Marcus's emotional life warranted serious attention, while mine was less significant, that his relationships were legitimate subjects of family interest, while mine were private matters I should manage independently. The asymmetry taught me that I should not expect others to care deeply about my emotional experiences, that seeking support or expressing vulnerability was appropriate for some people but not for me, that I needed to develop self-sufficiency in emotional regulation, just as I had developed self-sufficiency in academic and practical domains. The college preparation process crystallized these patterns in ways that would have lasting impact on our respective trajectories. Marcus's college search had been a major family undertaking spanning his entire junior year and the summer before senior year. Our parents had taken him on an extensive tour of potential schools, visiting campuses across the country, and helping him evaluate which institutions might offer the best combination of academic quality, social environment, and career preparation. They had hired a college admissions consultant who helped him craft application essays, prepare for interviews, and present himself most advantageously to admissions committees. They had reviewed his applications meticulously, providing feedback on every element, and ensuring he presented the strongest possible candidacy. When Marcus was accepted to several prestigious business programs, our parents had treated the acceptances as validation of their parenting and their son's capabilities. They had helped him evaluate the offers carefully, considering not just academic reputation but also financial aid packages, location advantages, and alumni network strength. They had made the final decision a family discussion, with everyone's input theoretically welcome, though Marcus's preferences clearly carried the most weight. Once he selected his school, they had celebrated extensively, throwing a party for family and friends and purchasing university-branded clothing and accessories that they wore proudly to demonstrate their connection to this achievement. My college preparation 2 years later had been a more solitary endeavor. Our parents had assumed I would manage the process largely independently, treating my capability for self-direction as evidence that I did not need the level of support they had provided Marcus. They had not arranged college tours or hired consultants. They had not reviewed my applications with the same meticulousness or provided comparable feedback on essays and presentation. They had expressed confidence that I would figure out what I needed to do and do it well, a vote of confidence that was simultaneously complimentary and neglectful, acknowledging my competence while absolving them of the responsibility to provide active guidance and support. When I was accepted to graduate programs in environmental science with full fellowship funding, their response had been pleased but relatively muted. They had congratulated me and expressed pride in my achievement, but they had not thrown parties or made the acceptance a major family celebration. They had not helped me evaluate offers with the same intensity they had brought to Marcus's decision-making process. They had trusted that I would make good decisions, and had not felt compelled to involve themselves deeply in choices that would shape my future trajectory. The contrast between their intensive involvement in Marcus's college selection and their hands-off approach to mine communicated clearly which child's future they considered more consequential and worthy of family investment. These patterns had extended to the practical and financial dimensions of our college experiences. Marcus had attended an expensive private university, with our parents covering costs that exceeded what my later graduate fellowship would provide in stipend and tuition coverage. They had supplemented his financial aid package substantially, ensuring he could participate fully in campus life without worrying about money or needing to work during the academic year. They had visited him multiple times each year, treating these visits as important opportunities to stay connected and understand his college experience. They had remained actively involved in his academic and social life, available for consultation about course selection, career planning, and personal challenges. My graduate school experience had been more financially independent by necessity and design. The fellowship covered tuition and provided a modest living stipend, but it did not stretch to cover all expenses comfortably. I had worked part-time throughout graduate school, managing research assistant positions that provided additional income, while also building relevant experience. Our parents had not offered to supplement my funding the way they had supplemented Marcus's, operating under the assumption that my fellowship represented adequate support, and that I was capable of managing any financial gaps through work or careful budgeting. They had visited me once during my entire graduate program, a brief weekend trip that felt obligatory rather than driven by genuine desire to understand my life and work. The disparity in financial support had not been acknowledged or explained. Our parents had never explicitly stated that they were investing more money in Marcus's education than in mine or articulated reasons why they believed this allocation was appropriate. The inequality had simply been enacted without discussion, as if the different levels of support were natural consequences of our different circumstances, rather than choices our parents made about how to distribute family resources. I had not challenged the disparity directly, had told myself that my fellowship meant I needed less support, and that Marcus's more expensive education therefore justified greater parental contribution. But beneath those rationalizations, I had understood that the financial inequality reflected the same pattern that organized every other dimension of our family relationships, with more resources flowing toward Marcus because his success and comfort were treated as higher priorities. The impact of these teenage and young adult experiences accumulated across time, each incident reinforcing lessons about my position within the family hierarchy and my reasonable expectations for treatment and support. By the time I completed graduate school and began my professional career, I had thoroughly internalized the understanding that I should expect less than Marcus received, that asking for equal treatment was unrealistic, that I should be grateful for whatever attention and support came my way rather than resentful about structural inequalities I could not change. I had learned to perform contentment with arrangements that actually left me feeling undervalued and peripheral, to present myself as not needing what I actually needed because expressing those needs would create uncomfortable conflicts nobody wanted to address. These learned patterns of accommodation and self-minimization had made me vulnerable to the wedding exclusion in ways I had not fully recognized until it occurred. I had been conditioned to accept that Marcus's preferences took precedence, that his comfort mattered more than mine, that his significant life events warranted full family participation, while mine warranted partial engagement. The wedding exclusion was simply the logical extension of patterns established across decades. Marcus had wanted a wedding without me present, Vanessa had supported that preference, and my parents had accepted the arrangement without protest because challenging it would have required them to confront the entire system of prioritization they had spent years constructing and maintaining. Understanding this history was essential for understanding why the exclusion hurt so profoundly, and why addressing it required more than simply resolving the immediate conflict about the wedding. The wedding was not an isolated injury, but rather the culmination of accumulated harm. The moment when patterns that had been sustainable at lower intensities finally exceeded my capacity for accommodation. Addressing the wedding meant addressing everything that came before it, challenging not just one decision but an entire architecture of family relationship that had systematically devalued my needs, minimized my importance, and treated my presence as optional rather than essential. The recognition that I had spent my entire life adapting to a family system designed to prioritize someone else's comfort and success was both devastating and clarifying. Devastating because it meant acknowledging that the people who should have loved me most equally had instead loved me conditionally and inadequately, had failed to provide the consistent support and recognition that children need to develop secure senses of self-worth. Clarifying because it meant that my dissatisfaction with family relationships was not evidence of my own inadequacy or excessive neediness, but rather a reasonable response to genuinely inadequate treatment, that I was not wrong to want more than I had received and not selfish to finally insist on better. The decision to move to Portland for graduate school had not felt like rebellion or escape when I made it during my final semester of undergraduate studies. I had framed the choice in purely practical terms, evaluating graduate programs based on faculty expertise, research opportunities, and alignment with my interests in environmental data systems and water quality analysis. Portland State University offered a strong program in exactly my area of focus, with professors conducting research that genuinely excited me and a stipend package that would allow me to pursue advanced study without accumulating the crushing debt that many graduate students faced. The city itself had appealed to me for its reputation as environmentally conscious and politically progressive, a place where concerns about ecological sustainability were taken seriously rather than dismissed as impractical idealism. What I had not fully acknowledged to myself at the time was that Portland also offered something less tangible but equally important. It was far enough from my family in Bellingham, Washington to create meaningful physical and psychological distance, a 3-hour drive that was substantial enough to prevent casual visits but not so extreme as to suggest I was fleeing dramatically. The distance would allow me to build a life that was genuinely mine, shaped by my own choices and values rather than by accommodation to family expectations and the constraining role I had been assigned within our household dynamics. I could claim I had chosen Portland for academic reasons, which was true, while quietly recognizing that the geography itself was part of the appeal, offering liberation I had not known how to request directly. The actual move occurred during a sweltering August weekend, with Jenna and 2 other college friends helping me load a rental truck with the accumulated possessions of my undergraduate years. My parents had offered to help with the move, but their offer had come with logistical complications that made it easier to decline than accept. They had wanted to coordinate the move around Marcus's schedule since he was visiting from Seattle that same weekend, suggesting we could all help together and then celebrate with a family dinner afterward. The suggestion had irritated me in ways I had not fully articulated at the time. This assumption that even my move to graduate school needed to be scheduled around Marcus's convenience and transformed into an occasion that centered him as much as me. I had told them I already had help arranged and that I preferred to keep the move simple rather than turning it into a larger family event, a boundary that had felt both necessary and slightly guilty. My parents had accepted this explanation without protest, responding with what I recognized as relief that they would not need to spend a weekend doing physical labor in the August heat. They had given me money toward moving expenses, a generous check that represented more financial support than they typically provided, though still substantially less than they had spent helping Marcus furnish his first apartment after business school. I had accepted the money with gratitude while noting the disparity, another data point in the accumulated evidence of differential treatment that I was becoming increasingly unable to ignore even as I continued trying to rationalize it away. The drive to Portland with Jenna had been filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The recognition that I was creating distance from family patterns that had constrained me combined with uncertainty about whether I possessed the capability to build something better in the space that distance would create. Jenna had understood what I was doing more clearly than I understood it myself at the time. She had said at one point during the drive, unprompted by anything I had expressed aloud, that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was give themselves permission to want more than they had been given, to stop accepting inadequate treatment simply because it was familiar and therefore felt normal. Her words had landed with unexpected force, articulating something I had been circling around without quite naming. I had spent so many years telling myself that my family dynamics were normal enough, that all families had their imperfections and inequalities, that I was probably being too sensitive or demanding and wanting treatment more equal to what Marcus received. Jenna was giving me permission to trust my perceptions, to recognize that my dissatisfaction was legitimate, rather than evidence of personal failing, to believe that I deserved relationships characterized by genuine equity and reciprocal care, rather than structural hierarchy. Portland itself had exceeded my expectations from the moment I arrived. The city possessed an energy and ethos that felt aligned with my values in ways that Bellingham never had despite its smaller-scale progressive reputation. There were bike lanes everywhere, public transportation that actually functioned, farmers markets and community gardens, extensive park systems and protected natural areas within and surrounding the city. The culture emphasized environmental consciousness and social responsibility, treating these as normal priorities rather than niche concerns. I had felt almost immediately that I had found a place where my particular configuration of interests and values made sense, where I would not need to constantly translate or justify caring about ecological sustainability and data-driven environmental policy. The graduate program itself had been intellectually rigorous and deeply engaging, exactly what I had hoped for and needed. My advisor was a woman in her 50s who had built her career studying freshwater ecosystems, and who approached her research with a combination of scientific precision and genuine passion for protecting the natural systems she studied. She had taken interest in me not just as a graduate student contributing labor to her research projects, but as a developing scholar with my own questions and perspectives worth cultivating. She had asked what I wanted to learn, what problems I found most compelling, what kind of career I envisioned building. She had listened to my answers and helped me design a course of study that would prepare me for the work I actually wanted to do, rather than simply slotting me into predetermined tracks. The experience of having an authority figure invest in understanding my goals and supporting my development had been revelatory. I had not fully recognized how much I had been missing that kind of engaged mentorship until I experienced it, had not understood how much my potential had been constrained by lack of adults who cared enough to help me think carefully about what I might become and how I might get there. My advisor had provided feedback that was simultaneously demanding and supportive, holding me to high standards while also expressing confidence that I could meet those standards. She had introduced me to other researchers in my field, helped me navigate conference presentations and publication processes, treated my emerging career as something worthy of her time and attention. Beyond academics, Portland had offered me the opportunity to build a social life organized entirely around my own preferences and values, rather than around accommodation to others' expectations. I had connected with people through my graduate program, through environmental volunteer work, through outdoor recreation groups focused on hiking and kayaking. These were people who shared my interests and understood my priorities, who valued the same things I valued, and who made space for substantive conversation about topics that mattered. The friendships I formed during those first years in Portland possessed a quality of mutual recognition and reciprocity that had been largely absent from my family relationships. These were people who remembered what I told them, who asked follow-up questions demonstrating they had actually listened and cared about my answers, who showed up when they said they would and followed through on commitments they made. One friendship in particular had become foundational during my second year of graduate school. I had met Adrian through a volunteer stream monitoring project, both of us collecting water samples and macroinvertebrate specimens on cold Saturday mornings as part of a citizen science initiative tracking water quality in urban watersheds. Adrian worked as a data analyst for a public health nonprofit, bringing technical skills similar to mine but applied to different problems. We had discovered quickly that we shared not just professional interests, but also similar life experiences of feeling somewhat out of place in our families of origin, of having built independent lives that made sense to us even when they confused or disappointed the people who had raised us. Adrian's family situation differed from mine in specifics but carried similar emotional weight. He had grown up as the youngest of 4 children in a large Catholic family that had expected him to follow conventional paths toward marriage and children, expectations that had collided painfully with his identity as a gay man who had needed to come out during college and navigate his family's difficult adjustment to information that challenged their assumptions. His family had not disowned him, had eventually reached a place of conditional acceptance, but he had learned the same lessons I had learned about accommodation and self-minimization, about making oneself smaller to preserve relationships with people who could not or would not fully embrace who he was. Our friendship had been built on mutual understanding of what it meant to love people who could not love you fully in return, to maintain relationships with families who accepted you only within carefully policed boundaries. We had spent hours talking about these dynamics, helping each other recognize patterns and name experiences that were difficult to articulate alone. Adrian had been the first person who helped me see clearly that my family's treatment of me was not normal or acceptable, that the differential attention and support represented genuine harm rather than inevitable family variation. He had helped me understand that I was not obligated to continue accepting treatment that diminished me simply because the people providing that treatment were my biological relatives. These Portland relationships, my advisor and Adrian and the broader community of people who actually saw and valued me, had provided the foundation I needed to begin imagining different possibilities for how I might live and what I might reasonably expect from relationships. I had learned that it was possible to be known and appreciated for who I actually was rather than for my willingness to accommodate others' needs and preferences. I had learned that reciprocity was not an unrealistic expectation, but rather a basic feature of healthy relationships. I had learned that I did not need to minimize my accomplishments or downplay my needs to be acceptable to people who genuinely cared about me. The professional dimension of my Portland life had also exceeded what I had imagined possible. After completing my graduate degree, I had been hired by a regional environmental nonprofit focused on water quality advocacy and policy development. The organization worked at the intersection of scientific research and political engagement, using rigorous data collection and analysis to inform policy recommendations and hold government agencies and private industry accountable for protecting water resources. The work was exactly what I had hoped to do, combining my technical skills in data analysis with my commitment to environmental protection, allowing me to contribute to something larger than myself, while also earning a living wage that made Portland's admittedly high cost of living manageable, if not comfortable. My colleagues at the nonprofit had been uniformly excellent, people who had chosen careers in environmental advocacy because they genuinely cared about the work rather than because it offered impressive salaries or status markers. We had operated as a genuine team, with everyone's contributions valued and everyone's expertise respected regardless of job title or seniority. The executive director had been particularly skilled at creating organizational culture that balanced high-performance expectations with authentic appreciation for people's efforts and recognition of the reality that we were all working hard for relatively modest compensation, because we believed the mission mattered more than maximizing our individual earning potential. This professional environment had taught me what it felt like to be part of something functional, to participate in a system where people actually followed through on stated values rather than merely performing them for external audiences. When someone at the organization said they valued collaboration, they actually made decisions collaboratively rather than simply using the language of collaboration to mask hierarchical control. When leadership said they valued work-life balance, they actually protected people's time off and discouraged after-hours communication except in genuine emergencies. When colleagues said they appreciated someone's contribution, they expressed that appreciation concretely through acknowledgement in meetings, support for professional development opportunities, and advocacy for appropriate compensation increases. The contrast between this functional professional environment and my dysfunctional family environment had become impossible to ignore. At work, I was treated as competent and valuable. At home, I was treated as peripheral and optional. At work, my contributions were recognized and celebrated. At home, my achievements were acknowledged briefly before conversation pivoted to more compelling topics. At work, I was included in decision-making processes that affected me. At home, major decisions affecting family gatherings and relationships were made without my input or even my awareness. The disparity had made it increasingly difficult to maintain the rationalizations I had previously used to excuse my family's treatment, increasingly difficult to convince myself that I was expecting too much or being too sensitive about patterns that would be obvious problems in any other relationship context. The distance Portland provided had been essential for this recognition. When I had lived closer to my family and seen them more frequently, I had remained somewhat enmeshed in their dynamics, unable to achieve sufficient perspective to evaluate those dynamics critically. The physical distance combined with the emotional and psychological distance that came from building an independent life had allowed me to see my family relationships more clearly, to recognize that what I had accepted as normal was actually harmful, to understand that I had been accommodating mistreatment rather than participating in reasonably imperfect but fundamentally loving relationships. This recognition had been gradual rather than sudden, accumulating across years of living independently and experiencing what healthy relationships actually looked like. There had not been a single dramatic moment of realization but rather a slow accretion of evidence that my family's treatment of me fell well below the standards I applied to every other relationship in my life. I would not accept from friends the kind of differential treatment my family provided. I would not accept from colleagues the kind of dismissiveness my family demonstrated. I would not accept from romantic partners the kind of deprioritization my family enacted. Why, then, was I accepting it from family members simply because we shared genetic material and childhood history? The question had begun haunting me during the months before Marcus's wedding, before I knew there was a wedding to be excluded from. I had been noticing with increasing frequency how little my family actually knew about my life, how seldom they asked substantive questions about my work or my interests or my relationships. I had been recognizing how one-sided our interactions had become, with me consistently making efforts to maintain connection that were not reciprocated with comparable effort from them. I had been observing how family gatherings centered Marcus's life while treating mine as background information, how conversations about him were detailed and engaged while conversations about me were perfunctory and quickly concluded. These observations had been creating a low-grade sense of dissatisfaction and hurt that I had not quite known what to do with. I had not felt I could simply walk away from my family, had not possessed frameworks for understanding that maintaining boundaries with family members was legitimate rather than evidence of coldness or dysfunction on my part. I had still believed at some level that family relationships were special, that they warranted more patience and accommodation than other relationships, that I had an obligation to preserve them even when they consistently left me feeling undervalued and peripheral. The wedding exclusion had shattered those beliefs by exceeding the bounds of what even extraordinary patience and accommodation could excuse or absorb. It had forced me to confront that my family was not going to change, that no amount of my effort or understanding or flexibility would transform them into people capable of treating me equitably, that the patterns established across decades were not temporary difficulties to be weathered but permanent structures that would shape our relationships indefinitely unless I actively chose something different. Portland had given me the resources to choose something different. The city had provided me with a life I did not want to sacrifice to maintain relationships with people who had demonstrated repeatedly that they did not value my presence or prioritize my well-being. I had work that mattered, friends who knew and appreciated me, a community that aligned with my values, a sense of belonging that was not contingent on making myself smaller or more convenient for others. I had built something real and sustaining, something worth protecting even if that protection required creating more distance from family members who would not or could not offer me the reciprocal care and respect that characterized all my other significant relationships. The recognition that I had created a life worth protecting, a life that did not depend on family validation or inclusion, had been simultaneously empowering and heartbreaking. Empowering because it meant I was not trapped in family dynamics that diminished me, not dependent on their approval or presence to have a meaningful existence. Heartbreaking because it meant accepting that the family relationships I had hoped might eventually improve were actually beyond my capacity to repair, that the people I wanted to love me properly were not capable of or interested in doing the internal work that proper love would require. This acceptance had been settling into place gradually during the months before I discovered the wedding had occurred without me. By the time I saw those Instagram photos, I had already been moving toward recognition that my family relationships were not sustainable in their current form, that something fundamental needed to change even though I had not yet determined what that change should look like. The wedding exclusion had simply accelerated a process already underway, had provided the catalyst that transformed vague dissatisfaction into clear recognition that I could not continue accepting treatment that consistently communicated I was dispensable and peripheral to people who should have considered me essential. Portland had made it possible for me to survive that recognition. The life I had built there meant that family rejection, while painful, was not devastating in the way it might have been if I had remained more dependent on family relationships for my sense of identity and belonging. I had other sources of validation and connection, other relationships that demonstrated daily that I was valuable and worth knowing deeply. Those relationships had given me the strength to finally insist on being treated with basic dignity and respect by my family, to refuse to continue accommodating mistreatment simply because the people mistreating me shared my last name and my childhood home. The years in Portland between completing graduate school and discovering Marcus's wedding had been characterized by steady accumulation of experiences that demonstrated what healthy relationships and functional systems actually looked like. These experiences had not arrived dramatically or all at once, but had instead built gradually, each positive interaction and reciprocal relationship adding to a foundation that would eventually give me the strength to recognize and reject the dysfunctional patterns that had defined my family connections. The process of building this alternative life had been less about conscious rebellion against my family and more about natural gravitation toward people and environments where I felt genuinely valued rather than merely tolerated. The nonprofit where I worked after graduate school had become far more than just employment. It had evolved into a community that modeled the kind of collaborative, equitable dynamics I had not experienced in family contexts. The organization employed approximately 30 people working across research, policy advocacy, community education, and administrative functions. Despite the relatively small size, or perhaps because of it, the workplace culture emphasized genuine connection and mutual support, rather than the competitive, hierarchical dynamics that characterized many professional environments. People actually cared about each other as whole human beings rather than merely as contributors of labor toward organizational goals. My immediate supervisor, a woman named Catherine who directed the research division, had demonstrated from my first week what it looked like when someone in authority actually invested in supporting the people they managed. She had scheduled regular one-on-one meetings with me not just to review project progress, but to genuinely understand what I hoped to learn and accomplish in my role. She had asked about my career aspirations, and then actively worked to create opportunities that would advance those aspirations. When I expressed interest in learning more about the policy side of environmental work, she had connected me with colleagues in the advocacy division and arranged for me to participate in legislative briefings where I could see how research translated into policy recommendations. Catherine had also modeled healthy boundaries and realistic expectations about work-life balance. She had made clear that while our work was important, and we all needed to be committed to it, that commitment did not require sacrificing our health or personal relationships. She actively discouraged people from working excessive hours, sent people home when they seemed burned out, and led by example by maintaining her own boundaries around evenings and weekends except during genuine emergencies. The message she communicated consistently was that we were all whole people with lives and needs beyond work, that taking care of ourselves made us more effective professionals rather than less committed ones, that sustainability required treating people as valuable in themselves rather than merely as instruments for accomplishing organizational objectives. This approach had been revelatory for me. I had entered professional life with assumptions shaped by my family experiences, believing that my value depended on my usefulness and productivity, that asking for support or accommodation was evidence of weakness or inadequacy, that I needed to constantly prove my worth through exceptional performance and minimal neediness. Catherine had challenged those assumptions through consistent demonstration that competent people still needed support, that asking for help was professional rather than inadequate, that my worth was not contingent on never expressing needs or limitations. One particular incident during my second year at the organization had crystallized this lesson in ways that affected how I understood all my relationships. I had been managing a complex data analysis project with a tight deadline, working long hours to complete the work, while also dealing with a persistent health issue that I had been ignoring, because acknowledging it felt like admitting weakness. Catherine had noticed that I looked exhausted and unwell, had asked directly whether I was okay, and had not accepted my reflexive assurance that everything was fine. She had said that she needed me to be honest about my capacity because pushing through health problems was neither sustainable nor beneficial to anyone, that taking time to address medical issues now would prevent more serious problems later, and that the project timeline could be adjusted if necessary to protect my well-being. Her insistence had given me permission to acknowledge that I was not actually fine, that I needed to see a doctor and probably needed to reduce my workload temporarily while addressing the health issue. I had expected that this admission would damage her perception of me, would mark me as unreliable or insufficiently committed. Instead, she had responded with practical support, redistributing some of my responsibilities to other team members and extending the project deadline. She had checked in regularly during my recovery, not to pressure me about work, but to ensure I was actually resting and receiving appropriate care. When I returned to full capacity, she had welcomed me back without any suggestion that the temporary accommodation had diminished her confidence in me or my standing within the organization. The experience had taught me that support and accommodation were not signs of weakness but rather normal features of functional relationships, that competent people still had limitations and needs that deserved respect, that admitting difficulty was not the same as admitting inadequacy. The lesson had extended beyond my professional life, into how I understood personal relationships and family dynamics. If Catherine could provide this kind of supportive leadership to an employee, someone she had no biological obligation toward, why could my family not provide comparable support to a daughter and sister? The contrast had made it impossible to continue rationalizing away the deficits in how my family treated me. Beyond the formal workplace relationships, I had also built genuine friendships with several colleagues who shared not just professional interests, but also compatible values and life perspectives. There was Marcus, which had initially created awkward confusion given the name overlap with my brother, though we had quickly adopted the clarifying convention of referring to him as Work Marcus to distinguish him from Family Marcus in conversations. Work Marcus was a policy analyst who had come to environmental advocacy from a background in urban planning, bringing expertise in how land use decisions affected watershed health and water quality. He possessed a combination of analytical rigor and genuine enthusiasm for the work that made collaboration with him both productive and enjoyable. Work Marcus had become someone I could trust to provide honest feedback and reliable support, someone whose consistency and follow-through stood in stark contrast to my brother's pattern of promising connection while delivering minimal effort. When Work Marcus said he would review a draft report, he actually did it within the time frame he had specified. When he offered to help with a challenging project, he showed up prepared and engaged. When he made plans to get coffee or attend a community event together, he remembered and arrived on time. These might seem like minimal expectations, basic requirements of any functional relationship, but they were requirements my family had consistently failed to meet. The contrast had highlighted just how much emotional energy I had been spending on relationships with people who could not or would not demonstrate basic reliability and reciprocity. Another colleague who had become a close friend was Diane, who managed the organization's community education programs. Diane was in her early 40s, had 2 school-age children, and somehow managed to balance demanding work responsibilities with active parenting, while also maintaining friendships and pursuing her own interests in a way that seemed almost magical to me. She had become something of a mentor in how to navigate professional life while also protecting personal priorities, demonstrating that it was possible to be committed to meaningful work without allowing that work to consume everything else. Diane had also provided perspective on family relationships that I had desperately needed. She came from a large family with complicated dynamics, and had spent years working to establish boundaries that protected her well-being, while maintaining connections she valued. She had talked openly about the difficulty of that process, about the guilt and doubt that accompanied setting limits with family members who insisted that real love meant unlimited accommodation. She had shared her own struggles with recognizing that she could not change her family members, but could only control how she responded to them, that sometimes the most loving thing she could do for herself was to create distance from people whose patterns of behavior were harmful regardless of their intentions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.